Hello, and welcome to our lecture for Chapter 3 of Knowledge, a Very Short Introduction on the rationalism versus empiricism debate. Now, this is a classic debate in epistemology, both in history as well as in contemporary, ongoing philosophical work. Now, as I'm assuming you have read the chapter, I'm going to assume that you are familiar with a lot of the material that's been covered in there. We will quickly review it, but if things don't make sense to you, go back and take a look at that chapter. I'm also going to add some more material on over and above what we discussed in the chapter to help us give us a better understanding of how the rationalism-empiricism debate fits into the overarching questions of epistemology. First thing for us to discuss is what really is the question at stake here. And the question we're going to be most interested in asking is, do we need experience to have knowledge? Or is there some sort of knowledge that might be preloaded or fundamental to the way that our minds work such that we can know something without having any experience with it? Now, this might sound a little fuzzy at first, but as we move through, we're going to get more clear pictures of what these things mean, and we'll be able to see why various people have argued in various ways. The two basic theories here are rationalism and empiricism. The rationalists believe that there is some knowledge that does not require experience. Typically, this is going to take the form of something that is fundamental to the way we think, such that you just know it. Things like, you might just know that nothing can be both true and false at the same time. On the other hand, we have empiricists. And empiricists are going to say that all knowledge must be based upon experience. That is, we have to have some interaction with the world before we can have any experience, or before we can have any knowledge about it, or knowledge about anything else. Now, this doesn't mean that we can only know about those things we've experienced, because we'll be able to use those things we have already acquired as building blocks, but we'll talk about that some more in a minute. First, let's take a look at two historical figures who are especially important to this debate, who are discussed in our text. The two most important figures to the rationalist-empiricist debate are René Descartes and John Locke. René Descartes on the rationalist side, John Locke on the empiricist side. And essentially you can think of them as the forefathers of their respective views, though there are people before them who share their views somewhat. Plato more rationalist, Aristotle more empiricist, that sort of thing. But this is really where the debate, as we see it in modern epistemology, picks up. And there is a reason that at this time in history, as these two people are writing, which is going to be around the 1600s, early to mid-1600s especially, and up to the 1700s, there's a reason that these questions are especially prominent. Now, one is the collapse of the pre-modern analogical system of thinking. This idea that things were structured alike. So, you got 7 holes in your head, you're going to have 7 planets. You've got day and night, so there must be 2 sides to all things, right? These sorts of thought processes started to be pushed aside around the time that René Descartes and John Locke were coming around. And they were being pushed aside in favor of a scientific worldview, championed most notably by Galileo. Now, Galileo produced a mathematical physics, which radically changed our understanding of the universe. And at the same time, we just have a lot of astronomers adding new observations, so things like, hey, maybe there are more than 7 planets, and hey, maybe the Earth isn't the center of the solar system. And this presented a challenge for the existing epistemic frameworks of the era. So what we needed, or what they felt they needed, was a way to establish an anti-skeptical worldview. That is, a worldview in which we could know things that was coherent in this new and rapidly changing context where we're finding out that a lot of the ways we used to think we knew stuff, a lot of the ways we used to go about reasoning, didn't work at all. Couple this with the fact that the status of religion is going to be shifting somewhat, right? So, in the medieval era, the Catholic Church, especially in the West, had an extraordinary amount of political and epistemic influence. This is weakening throughout history until we get to this point where the Catholic Church is, while still an incredibly powerful force, not going to be the dominant epistemic system anymore. This also has to do with the rise of scientific reasoning. So let's take a closer look at these two men and their views. So first we've got René Descartes, 1596 to 1650. He was a French Catholic theologian and scholar, and he was writing mostly about, in fact, almost entirely about epistemology, so theory of knowledge, physics, so he did some work on optics and that sort of thing, and mathematics. The Cartesian coordinate system, the XY axis, that's this guy. He had a very strong focus on mathematical reasoning in general, and that shows up in his rationalism and is in fact either influenced by or influences it. It's hard to tell which way, but they're very closely connected. Rationalists tend to like things like mathematics because it's a good example of something that might be pre-experiential or have ideas that are built into our head, right? It's purely logical. You've never experienced 10 billion plus 10 billion, but you can all tell me it's 20 billion, right? There doesn't seem to have been the proper experience there, but yet you can give the summation. Now, of course, the empiricists have their responses here. John Locke, on the other hand, was a British philosopher, I believe, who was connected with a Unitarian sort of view, a non-standard Christian faith. He was working from 1632 to 1704. He's especially important, or interesting, I think, in this context, because his epistemic views branch out and connect to political and ethical views that he had. So whereas Descartes mainly worked in epistemology, the sciences, and mathematics, John Locke had something of a wider focus. He had one particularly important phrase in his philosophy that at least all of you who are American citizens presumably should recognize, which is life, liberty, and property. This was adjusted to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness when it was adopted by our founding fathers in the United States here as one of the founding principles of how the United States should be run. And he was very much a man in favor of liberty. He was very much in favor of ideological liberty, especially, right? The ability to discuss your ideas freely, even if they cut against popular views. So those are our two characters. Now let's look at what they did. So Descartes' rationalism is built as a response to the skeptic. Particularly, it's a particularist response. Now, we talked about that idea in our last lecture. Particularism is a type of response to the skeptic, right, where you look at an individual truth, and you take the properties of that truth to distinguish what it is that tells you that it's true, and use that as a way to make a method. So you're looking at this one thing you know is true, and then you're saying, well, I know it's true. Well, look at this funny thing it has. Well, so for Descartes, for instance, the known truth was the cogito, which is, I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum. Even though that formulation never appeared in the Meditations, but it was very similar. The idea being that no one can genuinely doubt their own existence. It's somewhat incomprehensible to do so. So that's our foundation. This is a type of approach also called a foundationalism, which we'll talk about a little bit in 2 lectures. So he's got that idea. He says, all right, I know the cogito. I know that I exist. Now, what is it about this proposition that lets me guarantee I know it? Well, the thing that's special about it is that I have clear and distinct belief in it. He doesn't, interestingly enough, clearly and distinctly define what clear and distinct beliefs are, but he has this picture, right? Is when you think about it, you just can't deny it. You know exactly what it means, and you know it must be true. So knowing that those properties are what make the cogito special to him, that makes the cogito so we can never doubt it, he goes, okay, well, what else in the world has those properties? Because anything else that has that property must be true. And he would extend this to things like, well, I know, for instance, that God exists. I also know that God is not a deceiver, so whatever God created, whatever faculties he gave me, must be established in such a way so that I could understand the world as it is. And now, look at that, I've got a system of generating knowledge that is immune to the skeptic, because it's based off of indubitable propositions, totally undoubtable things. You could never question these ideas, so the skeptic has no ground, right? My foundation is solid, at least in his view. So, basic characterization of his knowledge that qualifies him as rationalist and how his rationalism works. Well, the first and most important thing is that the basis of knowledge here is not an experience. It's an abstract concept, right? For him, he's not saying, oh, I see my hands and that I'm moving in the world, so I know that I exist. In fact, in the first meditation, Descartes pushes for us to be very skeptical of all systems of experience, including sensation, especially sensation. In fact, he introduces an idea called dualism, that you yourself, your mind, is separate from the body. And the body is just this thing, this sort of robot you're piloting. But really, your soul, spirit, mind, however you'd like to talk about it, that's the real you. And you don't have any experience of that. What it is, though, is that the properties of how we are constructed make it a necessary intuition. That is, something you just have to believe in your gut, that you exist. Now, this qualifies this as rationalism, because the foundation of knowledge here, the basic elements of knowledge, are built in these properties of how we think, not in how we experience the world. Now, our abstract thought generates this knowledge because the cogito is rationally intuitive, and then we interpret what our standard of knowledge is, right? This clarity and distinctness, that's a property of abstract thought, right? That is a property of the way we think. So again, it's not just we have this one particular, though that's very important. What we have is a method of reasoning that prioritizes essentially the properties of our minds as rational beings. Now, remember that when Descartes is talking about mind, right, he's a dualist. Body and mind are separate. So he's not just saying our brain works in a certain way. In fact, of course, they didn't really understand how the brain worked all that well back then. He is talking about a non-physical mind, what would be coherent with the idea of a soul. One of the challenges he ran into was explaining exactly how those two things interacted. He believed that there was a gland in the brain called the pineal gland, which does exist, and he thought it served as something like a radio transmitter, so you'd have the right, and your soul would beam down and say, do this sort of thing. Obviously, that wasn't a very popular view, and still isn't today. Another thing that shows us that Descartes is a rationalist is his privileging of the rational form of thought over empirical experience. So senses, which are probably going to be the most basic form of knowledge for the empiricist, are dubious for Descartes. And the reason this is that the senses aren't designed. That is, remember, again, he's a Catholic theologian, so not designed by God, by the Catholic form of God, for the purpose of giving us truth. They're designed to help us survive. And that may not require us knowing what's true and what isn't. So we can kind of trust the senses because they are God-given, so they're probably going to be mostly reliable. But we shouldn't be surprised if they lead us astray. And the only way we can be sure to get it right, is if we really reflect, using the rationalist resources we have, right? Using our nature as a rational being to bounce our experiences off. So ultimately, it's our abstract thought that trumps everything. Let's contrast this now with an empiricist. So John Locke's empiricism. First thing he does, so they both respond to their skeptics in their own way, right? Descartes is going to say, essentially, the skeptic can't challenge me, look at me build my indubitable form. John Locke just says, yeah, there aren't really any actual skeptics. He believes that it's a fake view, essentially. He believes that we are all, quote-unquote, invincibly conscious of sensation. That is, you can say you're a skeptic all you want, but when you touch a burning, a piece of burning paper, you're gonna not be so skeptical about the fact that there's a fire, right? You can say you're a skeptic, but you aren't really. We are all invincibly conscious. That is, we are all undeniably aware of our experiences in the world. He has a secondary response, which is meant to say, okay, well, even if skeptics exist, even if skepticism is a legitimate view, and we can actually be skeptical, sensations help us to pursue our goals, right? And for him, he wants knowledge to be a tool to pursue happiness. And this is something that's very important for him in general, is the pursuit of happiness. This is why that phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, made it into our Founding Fathers' documents in the United States. Right. But so sensations help us pursue our goals, and they help us find pain and pleasure in the world. And that's as real as we need it to be. So, in so much as we need knowledge, this is as much knowledge as we ever need. This is the only kind of knowledge we ever need. If there is some higher standard, it's not worth paying attention to because it doesn't do anything for us. This is similar to a view called pragmatism that would come up in the 1900s, but we're a ways away from that. So, the empiricist characterization of knowledge, at least from Locke's version. So the basis of knowledge is observation and experience. experience of the physical world around us, right? I'm touching a bookshelf, right? You can make noises, smell the air, and all of these things, these are experiences. The reason we need experience, one of the many reasons, is that we are born tabula rasa, or blank slate. That is, we have nothing built in. This is just a blank canvas when we come in. There's nothing in the head when you're a baby. You don't know anything, you don't understand anything, you don't have any intuitions, you're just waiting to be filled by the world. We have two methods of learning, which is first, direct sensation, right? So that's the touch the bookshelf, hey, there's a bookshelf here. Or reflection upon mental operations. So things like, I am feeling a bookshelf here. This tells me that there's a bookshelf here. Or something to the effect of, oh, when I add 2 and 2 to get 4, so this must be a basic rule of mathematics. One thing that's important to note for the empiricist, right? It's not like they deny that mathematics exists or what have you. What they're saying is, the stuff that our thoughts are made out of comes from a sensation and experience. But we can use those things in a lot of different ways. That is, we can put them together to make more complex thoughts. So take, for instance, the idea of a Pegasus, a horse with wings. Well, no one's ever experienced that. But we have experienced horses, and we have experienced animals with wings, so we just... Right. So it all comes from experience. We're just putting it back together in different ways. For knowledge in the empiricist view, the question is going to be, do these ideas agree or disagree? That is, for instance, a circle is not a square, right? Immediate disagreement between these ideas or concepts. This gives us 3 kinds of knowledge based upon how well we can note this agreement or disagreement. Intuitive knowledge, which is immediately obvious that they agree or disagree, so a circle is not a square. A square is a rectangle. But these are immediately apparent. If you understand the concepts, you know the truth of the claim, right? You know these things agree. There's demonstrative knowledge, which requires some demonstration. And then there's sensitive knowledge, which is going to be something like, I feel there's a wall here. Now, this one might seem a little weird to qualify as knowledge, but if you think about it as something to the effect of comparing it to like a dream state, right? This is something that Descartes uses to attack our sensory understanding, saying, well, you could be dreaming and you wouldn't know. And Locke is saying, of course you would know. Because when I touch this, I say, all right, let me think about this. Does this feel like I'm really feeling it, or does it feel like I'm remembering feeling it? Okay, I'm really feeling it. And that's a different kind of thing. And he uses the term judgment for our probable beliefs as opposed to knowledge, so he just uses judgment in a somewhat different way than other people we've encountered. So the big difference between these two, right? You've got Descartes on the one hand prioritizing abstract thought, and Locke prioritizing experience. So let's see some of the basic concepts that are important to this debate as we move forward. There are 2 kinds of knowledge we should really talk about before we go any further. Or 2 kinds of statements or truths, however you want to phrase it. It's a priori and a posteriori. And you can think of it as prior and posterior. Posterior meaning behind, hence, but posterior. A priori means that you know it before experience. So an a priori truth is something that you are aware of the truth of it before having any encounter or experience with it. This kind of knowledge is essentially what the rationalist says exists. And it's very important to them that they be able to demonstrate some sort of a priori truth. On the other hand, you have a posteriori truth, or after the fact. So a posteriori truth is knowledge after experience. And the empiricist is saying that all knowledge is at least built up of a posteriori knowledge. Right? All of our ideas, all of our concepts comes from this. We should also distinguish 2 different debates the rationalist empiricist could have. On the one hand, they could be arguing about knowledge, particularly knowledge of propositions or states of the world. Right? Is a circle a square? Well, no. But saying that a circle is not a square is different than knowing what a circle is. That's conceptual knowledge. So we might be arguing on the one hand about the idea that, okay, can you have knowledge of states of affairs in the world, or in your mind, prior to experience? And can you have knowledge about concepts prior to experience of those concepts? These are 2 subtly different arguments, and there's going to be people who support both variations of both of these theses. Let's take a look now at a slightly more updated version of how the rationalist thinks versus the empiricist. Here are the major theses of rationalism and empiricism. Empiricism actually is pretty straightforward. All knowledge and concepts are generated from experience. Now, it could be or, depending on if they're really just taking a narrow view, right? They could say, well, I'm an empiricist about knowledge, states of affairs, propositions, but not about concepts. Or they might be a general blanket empiricist. And anything not gained in this way isn't knowledge. They tend to be skeptical towards anything that they can't think of a way it could come from experience. It's a way of saying, well, I guess that's just not knowledge then, if it can't be derived properly. Rationalism is a bit more complex. There are at least 4 different theses they might adopt. One is the intuition or deduction thesis. Intuitions are these sort of gut instincts we have. And so the intuition or deduction thesis is that intuitions and the beliefs we deduce from them, that is, derivative beliefs that are based upon those intuitions, supply knowledge. And importantly, for this to be a truly rationalist thesis, the intuitions themselves must be a priori. That is, they must not be influenced by experience. So Descartes could be considered to be presenting an intuition deduction thesis, essentially saying, my awareness of myself is indubitable by intuition. I know this is true. Now, this is going to be a problem for the rationalist if it turns out that intuitions are based on experience. And we do know that at least some intuitions, if not most intuitions, are based upon how we understand the world already. That is, they're theory-laden and experience-laden. The things we have experienced in the world can change what our intuitions are. This is why it is intuitive for some people that, for instance, it is wrong to, wrong to tell even a white lie to a friend to make them feel better, whereas some people think it's wrong not to, right? They just have different intuitions about this matter, and that tends to be because of the experience they have in the world. If that's an accurate account of intuitions, then the rationalist is in trouble, because that puts intuitions in the empiricist camp. However, the rationalist does not need all intuitions to be a priori. They just need one, right? All Descartes needs is the cogito. If you give him that, he wins. Right? Empiricism is in this sense a stronger claim in that it has more ways it can be disproven. Our next version is going to be the innatist thesis, which is that some knowledge or concepts are inbuilt. Now, this might sound a little funny, the idea that we're preloaded with ideas and ways the world works. But there are some modern thinkers who agree with this. Noam Chomsky, for instance, if any of you are familiar with linguistics, he's a very influential linguist, talks about this idea of the universal grammar. There's this funny thing. When you learn language, you learn it way faster than he thinks you should be able to from experience. This is called the poverty of stimulus argument. There's just not enough stuff going on for you to learn and generalize language the way you do. One of the ways we can point to, or one of the places we can demonstrate this, right, is you look at how humans speak. Like, imagine a little kid. They'll make grammatical errors that are more regular than the ungrammatical possibilities, right? So let's say we're talking about, I'm talking to a kid and I say, hey, I'm running today. And they're like, okay, did you run it yesterday? Right? Run it is agrammatical. It's not how you're supposed to say it. But they're doing the right thing according to the rule. Anyone who's ever tried to learn a second language knows how frustrating irregular verbs, irregular nouns are, right? It's enormously difficult to deal with that. Well, this child is overgeneralizing. Now, that overgeneralization, according to the poverty of stimulus argument, shouldn't be able to happen because they've never, ever heard anyone say that. They've never heard anyone say, I am running, or I runned yesterday, right? No one's told them that. But yet, here they are producing that statement. Now, the empiricists are going to say that actually this can be explained through the way that we learn things. Overgeneralization is a pretty common element of learning, and this doesn't require any innate knowledge or concepts. Something up in the air right now. The next step is going to be another thesis the rationalist might hold. It's called the indispensability of reason thesis. The idea here is that observation is just not enough to generate what we know. Again, the poverty of stimulus argument is going to come into play here. That's another place where, so the reason is indispensable to how we learn, but there's also things like the development of mathematical truths of things we've never experienced, right? That's going to involve reason beyond observation. Again, what the empiricists are going to say here is, it looks that way, but you're not paying enough attention. What's really happening is we're just putting a bunch of the raw stuff of experience together in a way that produces new information. But it's not that we are tapping into some magical sphere of reason where we're thinking experience independent. All we're doing is recombining our experience. And that's all we ever do. Finally, we have the superiority of reason thesis, that reason is more reliable than observation. And this is something that Descartes lies really heavily on in his arguments, right? The first stuff, the stuff that he thinks is the easiest to convince us to be skeptical about, is experience in the world, right? Is there really a bookshelf here? Well, maybe not, right? I could be dreaming, I could be hallucinating, but 2 + 2 = 4, that is way more certain. Right? That is way clearer than anything I experience in the world. Because all of my experiences could be wrong. My senses could be lying to me. This is a pretty common line of argument, even amongst skeptics who are not rationalists. So people who present their own skeptical arguments for other reasons. And so the idea here is that reason itself, pure reason, is more reliable than observation. Now, of course, the empiricist is going to say, I don't know if that's true or not, but pure reason doesn't exist, so it doesn't matter. Right? Well, that's only true. I can only have to grant that if you can demonstrate to me that there is such a thing as pure reason. I don't see any reason to believe that, so you're out of luck. So this is an overview of the rationalist-empiricist debate. There are a couple of things to keep in mind here. First is that this is a question about where we acquire our knowledge about states of affairs or propositions, and our knowledge about concepts. That is, do we come with preloaded ideas? Is there something about the way our minds work fundamentally that guarantees we know certain things? Or is everything really just a matter of experience, right? Is it all put together from experience? How we answer this question is going to influence how we answer the skeptic, right? Because if, for instance, our basis of knowledge is from experience, then we need to really focus on the skeptical challenges relating to experience, right? We need to know, for instance, is my sensation valid? If it's not, then I kind of just have to tip my hat to the skeptic and say, you win, right? I mean, you might say, okay, you win technically, but let's move on and ignore that and see what we can do anyway. But you have to just say, you're right, at least minimally. Now, the rationalist, on the other hand, right, they're going to be saying that all of knowledge, or some part of knowledge at least, comes from the operations of our mind, the nature of how our mind is structured. Not from any experience in the world, just from the way we're wired, the way we're built. We know certain things automatically. So these are the two theses we've encountered. The thing to be thinking about as you move forward from here is, which of these theses do you think is correct, or do you think we need some alternate view, right? What best explains how we come to understand the world and how knowledge can be generated? And, as a secondary question, what does this tell us about how we can construct our theory of knowledge and how we should relate to the skeptic's challenge? So that's all for Chapter 3's lecture. I'll see you next time to talk about Chapter 4.